The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Holt read it twice, then walked across the street to Clara Mercer's rented room above the feed store and dropped it on the table without a word. It was from the landlord. You have 14 days to vacate the premises. Widows with children are a liability this establishment can no longer afford. Clara had read those words so many times in 2 years that she almost didn't feel them anymore. Almost. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and turned back to the pot of thin soup from the soup stove, the same pot she'd been stretching for 3 days. Behind her, Nora was watching. She was always watching. If you've ever been told that you and your children were too much for this world, if you've ever stood in a doorway wondering whether anyone would ever choose you, then stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when a woman who has been turned away too many times finally meets a man who doesn't flinch. Before we go further, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done watching, leave a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Hit like if Clara's story speaks to you. Now, let's go back to Cedar Bluff, Montana. 1883. Clara Mercer was 31 years old and had the hands of a woman 10 years older. Not because she was careless with herself, but because she had never once stopped working long enough to be careful. Since James died 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago, not that she was counting she had taken in sewing, washed other people's laundry, scrubbed floors in the hotel on Birch Street, and still managed to keep her 3 children fed, if not always warm. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had cried at James's grave once and then told herself that was the last time, because tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, and her children needed someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. She didn't always know what she was doing. She just never let them see that. The room above the feed store was 2 windows and a slanted ceiling and a wood that ate coal faster than she could afford to buy it. Nora slept on the far side of the bed. Eli slept in the middle. Molly slept pressed against Clara's back with her rag doll, the one named Button because of Nesmasmich eyes, tucked under her chin. Clara slept on the edge. That was more or less how she felt about everything perched on the edge of something, waiting to fall. The advertisement had been sitting in her sewing basket for 3 weeks before she answered it. She'd found it tucked inside a newspaper that a customer had left behind, and she'd read it the way you read something you have no intention of doing anything about. Rancher, widower, Cedar Bluff, Montana, seeks a woman of good character for the purpose of marriage and partnership. No objection to prior circumstances. Respond to L. Hart, general delivery. No objection to prior circumstances. She'd stared at that line a long time. In Clara's experience, everyone had objections to prior circumstances. The boarding house on Maple had objected. The church women's committee had objected, politely with casseroles. 3 different employers had taken one look at her children and found reasons why the position had already been filled. She wrote the letter on a Sunday night after the children were asleep. She didn't write it the way a woman trying to sell herself would write it. She didn't soften anything. She wrote the truth. I am a widow. I have 3 children, a girl of 10, a boy of 7, and a girl of 4. I am hard-working, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I will not pretend the children don't exist either. If this is not what you are looking for, please do not write back. I have had enough disappointment to last me a while. She mailed it before she could change her mind. She didn't expect an answer. Levi Hart answered in 4 days. His letter was short, which surprised her. She'd half expected something formal and rehearsed, the way men who advertised for wives usually wrote, like they were filling out a cattle order. Levi's letter was 8 sentences long. He said he was 38, that he'd built his ranch from nothing over 15 years, that his wife had died 6 years ago, and that the house was too large for one person. He said he had read her letter twice. He said the children were not a problem. He said, and this was the sentence she kept coming back to, I haven't had a reason to set 4 chairs at the table in a very long time. I wouldn't mind having a reason again. She read it to no one. She folded it and put it at the bottom of her sewing basket, under the spools of thread, and for 3 days she pretended she hadn't received it. Then the landlord's notice arrived. She booked the train tickets that same afternoon. The morning they left, Eli dropped his shoe, getting off the boarding house steps, and it landed in the mud. He fished it out without complaining, which broke Clara's heart more than if he'd cried, because a 7-year-old boy who doesn't complain about muddy shoes has already learned not to expect things to go easily. Nora carried her own bag. She had insisted. She was 10 years old, and she had decided sometime in the last year that she was going to help carry things, whether anyone asked her to or not. And Clara had stopped arguing about it because arguing with Nora about anything was like arguing with a fence post possible, but ultimately pointless. Molly walked holding Clara's hand, Button tucked under her other arm, her eyes wide and watchful in the way that 4-year-olds get when they sense that something important is happening, but no one is explaining it to them. Where are we going? Molly had asked that morning, watching Clara fold their things into the trunk. Montana, Clara said. Is Montana far? Far enough. Will we come back? Clara had stopped folding for just a moment. No, she said quietly. We won't be coming back. Molly had thought about that for a second, then pressed her face against Button's yarn hair and said nothing more. On the train, Eli pressed his forehead against the window and watched the landscape change. Nora read the same page of a book for 40 minutes because she wasn't really reading. She was thinking. The way Nora thought, with that particular tight expression that meant she was working through something she didn't want to say out loud. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the miles pass and tried not to think about what Levi Hart would look like when he saw 3 children climbing off that train behind her. She had been honest in her letter. She had been clear. But there was a difference between reading 3 children on a piece of paper and watching them appear in real life. 1 muddy shoe, 1 serious face, 1 rag doll with button eyes. She tried to imagine what she would do if his expression changed. If she saw that flicker, that thing she'd seen on so many faces, that small involuntary shift that meant, this is more than I bargained for. She decided she would not beg. She would not apologize. She would gather her children, find somewhere for the night, and figure out what came next. She had always figured out what came next. She was very tired of figuring out what came next. Cedar Bluff's train platform was smaller than she expected, a narrow strip of weathered boards with a water tower at one end and a stack of freight crates at the other. Half a dozen people moved around in that particular unhurried way of small western towns, like they had all the time in the world and knew it. She saw him before she stepped off the train. He was standing at the far end of the platform, not right at the steps the way an eager man would stand, but back a little, hands in his coat pockets, watching the train arrive. He was taller than she'd imagined, not dramatically, but solidly. The kind of tall that goes with a man who has spent years doing physical work. He had a dark hat and a jaw that looked like it didn't move much when things weren't worth reacting to. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched her come down the steps. Clara kept her chin level. She had made a decision on that train. She was not going to arrive apologizing. She was not going to shuffle off those steps with her eyes down. She had answered a legitimate advertisement, written an honest letter, and traveled 400 miles. Whatever happened next, she was going to face it standing up. She reached the platform boards and turned to wait while Nora climbed down. Then Eli, then Molly, who needed both hands for the steps, and then immediately pressed herself against Clara's side with Button held tight. 4 people instead of 1. Clara turned toward Levi Hart. He was looking at the children. She watched his face. She had become very good at reading faces in the last 2 years, reading them quickly. The way you learn to read weather? If you live somewhere that punishes you for being caught off guard. She looked for the flicker, the slight tightening around the eyes, the breath that got held a half-second too long. She didn't find it. He looked at Eli first, who was looking back at him with a particular combination of hope and suspicion that had become Eli's default expression around adult men. He looked at Nora, who was watching him with open, calculating intensity the way she watched everything. He looked at Molly, who had buried her face against Clara's coat. Then he looked at Clara. Mrs. Mercer, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not unfriendly. Just careful, Mr. Hart, she said. They stood there for a moment, 2 strangers on a train platform, with the wind coming off the mountains and 400 miles of complicated honesty between them. Clara made herself say it. She had decided on the train that she was going to say it first. Before the awkward politeness of it festered into something worse. I want to be clear about something, she said. These are my children. Nora, Eli, and Molly. They are not going anywhere. That is not what you expected when you read my letter. I would rather know now than later. She watched him. He looked down at the children again. At Eli, who had lifted his chin a little. At Nora, who hadn't looked away once. At the top of Molly's head, still pressed against Clara's coat. Then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He crouched down. Not in the performative way adults sometimes do with children, the exaggerated crouch, the loud, cheerful voice, the immediate demand for a handshake or a smile. He just lowered himself to Molly's level and waited, patient as stone, until she turned her head slightly and looked at him from the shelter of her mother's coat. "Is that your doll?" he asked. Molly's grip on Button tightened. "Her name is Button," she said very quietly. "That's a good name," Levi said. He didn't reach out to touch it. He didn't make a fuss. He just nodded once. Like Button's name was a piece of reasonable information that had been delivered and received. Then he stood back up and looked at Clara. "I read your letter twice," he said, which was almost exactly what he'd said in his written reply. For some reason, that repetition, the fact that he apparently said what he meant and didn't rearrange it for different audiences, steadied something in her chest that had been unsteady for weeks. "I always wanted a big family," he said. "Turns out I just didn't know how to build one on my own." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She didn't trust it. She didn't distrust it either. She filed it away, the way she filed everything these days as evidence, to be weighed later when there was more of it. "Where's the wagon?" she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "This way," he said, and picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and started walking. Eli watched him do it. Then, without a word, he picked up his own bag and followed. Nora looked at Clara. Clara looked back. "Well," Nora said, in the particular tone of a 10-year-old, who has not yet decided whether to be relieved or suspicious. "He's tall." "He is," Clara agreed. "Papa wasn't that tall." "No," Clara said. "He wasn't." They walked. The road to the Hart Ranch took the better part of an hour, and Levi drove the wagon the way he seemed to do everything else, without wasted motion, without commentary that wasn't necessary. He told her the names of the mountains in the distance. He told her when to expect the first hard frost. He told her that the well was reliable and the stove in the kitchen burned clean if you knew how to manage the damper. Useful information, not performance. She noticed that Eli had moved to sit closer to Levi's end of the wagon seat, not right beside him, but closer, watching his hands on the reins, watching the way he read the horse's movements before they happened. Clara noticed. She always noticed things about her children. She stored it away. When the ranch came into view, the main house first, then the barn, then the smaller outbuildings strung out behind it. Clara's first thought was that it was larger than she'd imagined. Not a homesteader's cabin, but a real house, 2 stories, with a porch that wrapped around the front and windows that caught the late afternoon light. Her second thought was that it was painfully quiet. There were no other sounds, no voices, no movement except the horse in the wind. She had grown up in a house full of people. She had married into a house full of noise. Even the boarding room above the feed store had had neighbors on all sides, people moving above and below and through the walls, the constant ambient sound of other lives being lived nearby. This house was so quiet it almost had a sound of its own. She glanced at Levi. He was looking at the house too, and for just a second, a fraction of a second, she saw something cross his face that she recognized because she had seen it on her own face in mirrors. He had gotten used to the silence. He hadn't gotten comfortable with it. Molly had fallen asleep against Clara's arm. Nora was sitting very straight, studying the house with the focused attention she gave everything. Eli had leaned slightly forward, eyes on the barn. Clara looked at the house again. It had good bones. It had a porch. It had windows. Windows could let in a lot of noise if you opened them right. She thought, I don't know if this will work. She thought, I don't know if anything will work. But we're here now, and Molly is asleep on my arm, and the well is reliable. The wagon stopped. Levi climbed down and held out a hand to help her, which she accepted, because her arm had gone half numb under Molly's weight, and she needed the steadying. His hand was rough and very certain. She stepped down onto Montana soil for the first time in her life. The wind came off the mountains and pushed against her. She pushed back. The first night was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went dramatically wrong, which was almost stranger than if it had. Levi showed them the rooms upstairs, 2 of them, one for Clara and Molly. one that he'd quietly set up with a second cot beside the existing bed for Nora and Eli. Clara noticed that the cots had been made up with clean quilts, not just thrown together, and that someone had put a small oil lamp on the dresser between them. She didn't comment on it. She just noted it, the way she noted everything, and filed it somewhere she could examine later. Dinner was bread and a pot of bean soup that Levi had started before he'd driven to the station, which meant he had planned ahead, which meant he had assumed they would all be hungry, which meant he had been thinking about them practically before they even arrived. Clara wasn't sure what to do with that information either. Eli ate 2 bowls without being told he could have more. Molly fell asleep at the table with her chin nearly on her plate, and Clara caught her before she tipped forward, which made Nora almost smile and then stop herself. Because Nora had been almost smiling and stopping herself all evening, like she was rationing the expression. Levi cleared the dishes without making it into a statement. He didn't say, "I'll get those," in a way that expected to be thanked. He just picked them up and went to the kitchen, and Clara listened to the sounds of him moving around in there. Water running, a pot set down, a cabinet closing, and realized that those were the first sounds she'd heard in that house, besides their own voices. She put Molly to bed first, then sent Nora and Eli upstairs, over Eli's protest that he wasn't tired, which was contradicted by the fact that he was yawning so hard his jaw cracked. Then she sat at the kitchen table alone, while Levi poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped her hands around it. "Thank you," she said. "For the rooms." "You're welcome," he said. Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence exactly, but a working silence, the kind 2 people produce when they're both thinking, and neither of them is nervous enough to fill the air with noise. "I want to be useful," Clara said. "I don't know your routine yet, but I learn fast. Tell me what needs doing, and I'll do it." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You just traveled 400 miles with 3 children. You don't have to decide what needs doing tonight." "I know I don't have to. I want to." "Why?" She looked back at him steadily. "Because I'm not a guest here." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Levi Hart's face didn't do dramatic. But something settled. Like a door that had been slightly ajar finally finding its frame. "Kitchen," he said. "I'm fair at cooking, but I'm not good at it. And the garden in back needs more attention than I've been giving it. I've been too busy in the barn. I can manage a kitchen and a garden." "I figured," he said. "I'd have mentioned if I couldn't use the help." She almost smiled at that. "You're direct. Saves time," he said. She found out that night that Levi Hart had very little patience for performance and a great deal of patience for everything else. He didn't tell her the history of the ranch, or why he'd built it, or how hard it had been, the way men sometimes did, laying out their accomplishments like evidence in a trial. He talked the way people talk when they're not trying to impress anyone. A little about the cattle, a little about the neighboring ranches. A mention of a fence line on the south pasture that needed attention before winter. She told him about the children, not the soft version, but the real one. That Nora was sharp as a tack and twice as guarded and wouldn't warm up to him fast, if she warmed up at all, and he should not take it personally. That Eli wanted desperately to be useful and competent and would probably try to help with things he wasn't ready for yet. That Molly had nightmares sometimes, and if he heard crying in the night, it wasn't cause for alarm, just part of the landscape. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How long has the little one been having nightmares?" Clara hesitated. "Since her father died." "How long ago was that?" 2 years. He nodded once. That was all. He didn't offer a theory or a solution or a piece of unsolicited advice. He just absorbed it and moved on. And Clara found that more reassuring than if he'd said something sympathetic. They finished their coffee. The fire in the stove burned down to coals. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the darkness with a sound like something vast and unhurried. "I'll tell you something," Levi said, when they were both close to calling it a night. He was looking at the table, not at her, and she had the sense he was choosing his words with the same care he gave everything else. "I've been living in this house a long time by myself, gotten used to knowing where everything is and how everything works. Having people here is going to take some adjustment. I might get things wrong." Clara looked at him. "I've been keeping 3 children alive on a seamstress's wages for 2 years. I'm fairly used to adjusting." He looked at her then, And that time he did smile small and real and slightly crooked, like something that didn't get a lot of use. Fair enough, he said. She went upstairs. She lay on the edge of the bed with Molly pressed against her back and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood, the wind, the distant sound of Levi's boots on the stairs, and then the quiet that came after his door closed. She thought about the words "no objection to prior circumstances." She thought about the way he'd crouched down to Molly's level on the platform without making a production of it. She thought, this could still go wrong in 100 different ways. Thought, but tonight everyone is warm and everyone has eaten and the well is reliable. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. The first week had its own kind of geography, its ups and its sudden drops. The places where the ground held and the places where it didn't. Clara found the kitchen in reasonable shape, but clearly managed by someone who used it functionally rather than well. The spice shelf had salt and pepper and nothing else. The pantry was stocked, but without logic flour next to lamp oil, dried beans in a corner behind a coil of rope. She reorganized it on the second morning, not because she was making a claim, but because she couldn't cook efficiently out of chaos, and when Levi came in for midday coffee and noticed the changes, he looked at the pantry for a moment and then said, "That's better," and poured his coffee and went back out. She had expected at least a question about where something had been moved. He didn't ask. She thought about that for a while. Eli was the first of the children to break the invisible line they'd all been maintaining between themselves and Levi Hart. It happened on the third morning, the way most significant things happen, not as a moment, but as a thing that had been building and finally exceeded its own weight. Eli had been watching the barn since they arrived. Clara saw it at every meal, the way his eyes went to the window that faced that direction, the way he tracked Levi's comings and goings with the focused attention of someone studying a problem he very much wanted to solve. On the third morning, he finished breakfast fast and then sat there, instead of going upstairs, and Clara knew he was working up to something. She pretended to be busy at the stove. Levi finished his coffee and stood up. Eli said very quickly, before the moment could close, "Can I see the horses?" Levi stopped. He turned and looked at the boy. Eli held his ground. He was 7 years old, and his jaw was set in a way that Clara recognized as him bracing for a no. "Can you be quiet around them?" Levi asked. Eli blinked. "Yes, sir. The bay mare is skittish in the morning. You have to come in from the left side and let her smell your hand before you do anything else." Eli absorbed this very seriously. "Okay, come on then," Levi said, and walked out. Eli was off his chair before the door finished swinging. Clara stood at the stove and did not let herself make anything of it, because making things of things was how you got disappointed when they came to nothing. She just watched through the window as Eli followed Levi across the yard toward the barn, and noticed that Levi had slowed his stride to something a 7-year-old could match without running. Just that, nothing more. But she noticed. Nora came downstairs 20 minutes later, found Eli gone and the dishes still on the table, and looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has found a discrepancy in the accounts. "Where's Eli?" "Barn," Clara said. Nora's expression didn't change, but she went to the window and looked out. "He went by himself?" Mr. Hart took him. The silence that followed was the kind Nora used when she was recalculating something. She came and picked up the breakfast dishes without being asked. Clara let her. The second week was harder than the first, because by the second week, the novelty of new surroundings had worn off for the children, and the reality of their situation had settled in, and reality was a more complicated thing to sit with than uncertainty. Molly started asking questions Clara didn't have clean answers to. Not complicated questions Molly was for. Her questions were direct as hammers. "Is this our house now? Is this where we live? Is Mr. Hart going to be here every day?" Clara answered as honestly as she could. "This is our house now. Yes, this is where we live. Yes, Mr. Hart lives here and will be here. Does he like us?" Clara looked at her daughter. "Why do you ask that?" Molly shrugged in the way small children shrug, like the question had come from outside her, and she was just passing it along. "'Cause he looked at my doll, but he didn't touch it." "That's because he was being polite," Clara said. "He was letting you decide if it was all right." Molly thought about that. "Oh," she said, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. But Nora was the real concern. Nora moved through the first 2 weeks like she was conducting an inspection, quiet, methodical, assessing. She helped with meals and she kept her room in order, and she was never openly rude to Levi. But she maintained a distance that was so precise, it could only have been intentional. Clara tried talking to her about it one evening, when they were both in the kitchen after Molly was in bed. "You don't have to trust him," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to trust him." Nora was drying a dish with the focused attention she gave tasks she wanted to do properly. "Good," she said, "because I don't. I know. Mama." Nora put the dish down and looked at her, and sometimes when Nora looked at her straight on, Clara had the unsettling experience of seeing a much older person inside her daughter's face. He was nice on the platform. He was nice this week. But people are always nice at the beginning. Clara didn't say anything because Nora wasn't wrong. "Papa was sick and then he died," Nora said in the flat, careful voice she used when she was talking about things that still had sharp edges. "And after he died, everyone was so sorry. And then they stopped being sorry, and the landlord told us we had 2 weeks. You think I don't remember that?" "You remember everything," Clara said quietly. "So I'm not going to trust Mr. Hart just because he fixed Molly's doll." Clara looked at her. "When did he fix Molly's doll?" Nora blinked. Clearly, she hadn't meant to say that. "Yesterday. One of the button eyes came off and she was crying about it, and he found some thread and fixed it." "That's not," she stopped, picked up the dish again. "That's not the same as trusting someone." "No," Clara said. "It's not." She didn't say anything else about it. But later that night she found Molly's doll on the pillow beside her daughter, and she turned toward the lamp and looked at the repaired eye, 3 small stitches in dark thread. Not fine work. The kind of stitching a man did who didn't sew and was working carefully in spite of it. She set it back down. She sat for a long time in the dark. It was at the end of the 2nd week that she and Levi had their first real argument, and it came, as first real arguments usually do, from somewhere neither of them expected. It was about the pantry, or rather it started about the pantry. She had been working her way through the organizational problems of the house, doing it gradually, so it didn't feel like an invasion, and she had reached the upper shelf of the pantry, where Levi kept a collection of tools and hardware that had no business being anywhere near food. She had moved them to the shelf in the mudroom, which was a more sensible location, and had thought nothing more about it. Levi came in from the south pasture in a worse mood than usual. She'd noticed that the south pasture produced a particular kind of frustration in him, something to do with a fence dispute with the neighboring property, though she hadn't yet learned the full shape of it. Pantry for something, and went straight to the pantry and stopped when the shelf reorganized. He didn't explode. He wasn't a man who exploded, but his voice, when he turned around, had a tension in it that she hadn't heard before. "Keep certain things in particular places," he said. "It makes it easier to find them." "The tools were next to the flour," Clara said without turning from the stove. "I knew where they were. There were rusted nails in a paper bag next to the dried beans." "That's a food safety issue, Clara." He said her name with a particular flatness that meant he was making an effort to sound neutral. "I've been running this household for 6 years. I'd appreciate being consulted before things get moved." Turned then. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the expression of a man who was genuinely aggravated, but also aware that his grievance sounded smaller out loud than it had felt a moment ago. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have asked." He blinked. He had clearly been ready for her to argue. "I grew up rearranging things because it made me feel useful," she said. "I do it when I'm uncertain. I should have asked. I'll ask in the future." The tension in his face shifted into something more complicated. "The nails were a problem," he said, after a moment. "You were right about that. The mudroom shelf makes more sense. But I should have told you." He rubbed the back of his neck. With one hand she would learn this gesture, the particular way he reached for the back of his neck when he was recalibrating. "I'm not used to consulting," he said. 6 years of making decisions by myself. I'll probably get that wrong too." "Probably," she agreed, and turned back to the stove. He stood there another moment, and she heard what might have been a short exhale that was close to a laugh. "I'll be back for supper," he said. "It'll be ready," she said. He went out. She stood at the stove for a full minute without stirring anything, just letting the shape of that exchange settle. Not a disaster, not a victory either. Just 2 people figuring out where the edges were. It felt more real than anything that had happened in the previous 2 weeks. Eli came in from the barn that afternoon covered in hay dust and wearing an expression Clara had not seen on his face In over a year, the loose, unguarded look of a boy who had spent several hours being entirely absorbed in something he loved. "Mr. Hart let me brush the bay," he said. He said it the way he said things that meant a great deal to him, but that he wasn't sure he was allowed to say, meant a great deal carefully, watching her reaction. "Did he?" Clara said. "She's real soft on her nose. He showed me where to brush, so she doesn't get nervous. He says it's about going slow and letting them know where your hands are." He paused, then said, more quietly, like he was testing the water temperature, "He knows a lot about horses." "It sounds like he does," Clara said. Eli stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "He doesn't talk a lot, but when he says something it's true, you can tell." Clara looked at her son, 7 years old, and he had just made an assessment that took some adults decades. "He does seem like that," she said carefully. Eli nodded once, satisfied, and went to wash his hands. Nora, who had been sitting at the table with her book, had not looked up during any of this exchange. But when Eli left the room, she turned the page very deliberately, and Clara noticed she hadn't been reading for at least the last 5 minutes. Clara said nothing. She let it sit. She had learned with Nora that the surest way to shut a door was to try to force it open. 3 weeks in, Levi came to her about a different kind of problem. He found her in the garden one morning, working on the winter squash, and he stood at the garden's edge for a moment before he said anything, which meant he was deciding how to say it. "Nora asked me something this morning," he said. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. "What did she ask?" "She asked me what happened to my wife." Clara felt something cold move through her. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." He looked at the garden rather than at her. "That she got sick in the second winter, and that the doctor came twice, and that the second time wasn't enough. That she was buried on the east side of the property, and that I put a stone marker there in the spring." He paused. "I thought about softening it. But I thought your girl would know if I was softening it, and I didn't want to that." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You were right, she'd have known." "She didn't say much after that," Levi said. "She just nodded and went back inside. That's how she processes things. She needs to think about them alone first." He nodded. "Then, is she going to be all right, long term?" Clara looked up at him. At the directness of that question, not is she difficult or does she not like me, but is she going to be all right? "I think so," Clara said honestly. "She's been carrying too much for too long. But she's tough and she's smart, and she loves her brother and sister more than she loves being afraid. I think when she decides to trust someone, she'll mean it for life." Levi was quiet for a moment. "Her father," he said. "Was he good to her?" "He was a good man," Clara said. "He wasn't always a strong one, but he was good." Levi absorbed that the way he absorbed most information steadily, without reaction, letting it settle where it needed to. "My father was strong," he said. "Not always good." It was the most he'd said about his own history in 3 weeks. Clara didn't press it. She turned back to the winter squash, and after a moment she heard him walk away toward the barn, and she thought about the things that shape people, the specific weights they carry, that aren't visible from the outside, that only show up in the way they move, and what they choose to say, and what they choose to leave alone. She pulled a weed from between the squash plants. She thought, he's not performing goodness. He just is it, imperfectly, in the particular way you are something you actually believe. She thought, that's harder to dismiss than charm. She pulled another weed. The 4th week brought rain, 3 solid days of it, the kind of rain that turned the yard to mud and kept everyone inside and wore on the nerves of people who were still learning to share space. Eli got into a fight with Nora about something that started as whose turn it was to sit by the window and became, as children's arguments do, about something much larger and older than where they were sitting. Clara let them argue for a few minutes and then said, in the voice then endiments, that it was enough. They went sullen and separate to their corners of the house. She found Levi in the barn. He'd found reasons to be in the barn for most of the 3 rainy days. She'd noticed and she stood in the doorway rather than going in because the barn was his space, and she was still careful about that. "I wanted to warn you," she said. "The children are—" She tried to find the right word. "They're at each other today. The rain." He was repairing a leather strap, his hands working steadily without looking up. "I heard. They're not usually—" "Clara." He looked up. "They're children, cooped up in rain for 3 days. I didn't expect them to be perfect." She stood in the barn doorway with the rain falling behind her. "Most people do," she said. Expect them to be perfect. He went back to the leather strap. Most people are foolish about children, he said. She stood there for another moment. There was something she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, a question that sat at the edge of every conversation she had with this man, just outside the range of where she felt safe asking it. She wasn't sure she felt safe asking it now. But the rain had a way of making everything feel slightly more honest. Levi, she said. He looked up. Why did you advertise for a wife? She asked. And I don't mean the practical reason. There must have been women in Cedar Bluff who would have. There were, he said, and went back to his work. Then why? Because they wanted what I'd built, he said simply, without judgment, like he was describing a fact of weather. They wanted the ranch and the house and the money, which I understand. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I didn't want someone who wanted what I built. I wanted someone who he stopped. He pulled the leather strap taut and tested it. I wanted someone who'd be here because they needed to be, and I needed them to be, and we were both honest about that. Someone performing at something. He looked at her then, and it was one of those direct Levi Hart looks that had no agenda behind it, just the thing it was. Your letter, he said. You weren't performing. Clara stood in the barn doorway with the rain behind her and felt something inside her chest do something uncomfortable that she wasn't ready to name. No, she said, I wasn't. He nodded and went back to the leather strap. She went back to the house, where Nora and Eli had apparently reached some kind of armed truce and were sitting at opposite ends of the table not speaking. And Molly was in the middle of the floor, showing Button a bug she'd found under the baseboard. She put the kettle on. The rain kept falling. Outside the barn door was a yellow square of lamplight in the gray afternoon. She watched it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she turned back to the stove. The rain stopped on a Thursday, and the world came back mud and cold, and the particular smell of wet Montana earth that Clara was beginning to recognize as something specific to this place, different from the earth smell of Ohio, where she'd grown up, heavier somehow, more mineral, like the ground here had stronger opinions about being rained on. She found Molly's boots by the back door that morning, caked with mud from the previous day when the girl had escaped outside for 20 minutes. Before Clara caught her, and she was cleaning them at the back step when she heard Levi's voice from inside the barn, not loud. Not alarmed, just steady and even the way he talked to the horses. Couldn't make out the words, just the tone. The rhythm of someone who knew how to be calm at a horse's level and had been doing it for years, until it became the way he was with everything. She thought about what he'd said in the barn doorway. Your letter. You weren't performing. She scraped mud off the toe of Molly's left boot and told herself to stop thinking about it. That was the problem with Levi Hart. He said things that were true in the simplest possible way, and then just left them there, and Clara, who had spent 2 years being very careful about what she let herself think about, kept finding his plain truths sitting in the corners of her mind, like furniture she hadn't decided where to put yet. She was not in love with him. She was clear on that point. She had loved James Mercer, with the whole uncomplicated heart of a 20-year-old girl who hadn't yet learned that love and security were not the same thing. And she wasn't 20 anymore, and her heart had more rooms in it now, most of them locked for practical reasons. What she felt about Levi was something more cautious and more complicated, and she was not going to let herself name it prematurely, because naming things prematurely was how you got hurt. She put the boots by the door to dry and went inside to start breakfast. The 5th week started with Eli falling off a fence rail and landing hard enough to leave a bruise on his ribs that made him hiss when he breathed in too fast. Not broken, she'd checked carefully, pressing along each rib, while Eli tried to act like it didn't hurt, which meant it hurt considerably, but not broken. Levi came in from the barn and found Eli at the kitchen table being inspected, and asked one question. How bad? Bruised, Clara said. Not broken, Eli added, with emphasis, in the tone of someone providing evidence that he was fine and did not need to be treated as if he were not fine. Levi looked at the boy for a moment. Fence rail or the horse? Eli hesitated. Fence rail. You reached too far. Yes, sir. How high up were you? Another hesitation. 3rd rail. Levi pulled out a chair and sat down across from Eli. Did you fall forward or backward? Eli looked surprised by the question. Forward. Caught myself on my hands. Good instinct. Tucked your chin? When Eli looked uncertain, Levi said, next time you feel yourself going, tuck your chin to your chest. Keeps you from hitting your head. Clara watched her son's face shift from the defensive expression he'd worn through the rib inspection to something more focused. Okay, he said, arms hurt a little. That's the right way to fall, Levi said, and stood up. He looked at Clara. He's all right. I know he is, she said, because she'd already determined that, but she noticed that Eli sat a little straighter after Levi said it. Men confirming things to each other. She understood the mechanics of it, even if she found it slightly inefficient. The bruised ribs kept Eli out of the barn for 2 days, which was its own kind of punishment, and he spent those days following Clara around the house with the distracted energy of a dog that hadn't been walked. She put him to work splitting kindling carefully, with explicit instructions, standing beside him for the first dozen pieces. And he did it with the grim focus of someone serving time, but he did it well. Nora watched all of this from her usual position of careful distance. She was the variable Clara couldn't quite solve. Everything else on the Hart Ranch had a shape that Clara could work with: the kitchen, the garden, the laundry, even Levi's silences and the particular geography of his moods. But Nora had always been her own system, operating on her own logic, and what was happening inside her 10-year-old head during those first weeks, Clara could only partially read. She knew Nora had gone back to speak to Levi again, after the first conversation about his wife. She knew because Levi mentioned it not elaborately, just in the way he mentioned things he thought she ought to know. He said Nora had asked him about the east pasture marker, whether she could see it. He'd taken her out there. She'd stood in front of it for a while without saying anything, and then she'd asked if the woman buried there had been kind. Levi said he'd told her yes, she was very kind, and Nora had nodded and walked back to the house. Clara had no idea what her daughter made of that. She didn't ask. She waited, because with Nora waiting was the only thing that ever worked. It was the 6th week when everything began to shift in ways Clara had not anticipated and had not let herself expect. It started small, as shifts always do. Molly stopped carrying Button everywhere. Not permanently, the doll still appeared at meals and at bedtime, and in any situation Molly found uncertain, but she started leaving her on the windowsill in the mornings, which meant Molly was beginning to feel secure enough in her days that she didn't need Button with her every moment. Clara noticed. She noted it the way a doctor notes a patient's temperature dropping from the danger zone, quietly, professionally, not letting herself react too strongly because there was still a long way to go. Then Eli, on the first morning his ribs felt good enough, went to the barn before breakfast without asking permission. Just got up early and went. She heard the door and looked out and saw him crossing the yard in the gray dawn light. She waited to see if Levi would send him back for breakfast first. He didn't. 2 hours later, they came in together, Eli dusty and talking fast about something involving the bay mare and a loose shoe, and Levi answering in the short, complete sentences he used. And the two of them had the coordinated untidiness of people who had been working alongside each other, not just near each other. It was a small thing. It undid something in Clara's chest that she'd been keeping carefully knotted. She made them both wash their hands before they touched the biscuits. And then there was the evening that Nora finally broke. It happened without warning, the way the most significant moments usually did, buried inside an ordinary Tuesday, disguised as nothing. They had all finished supper, and Clara was washing dishes, and Molly was asleep, and Eli was on the porch with a piece of wood he'd been trying to whittle into a horse, badly, with a knife Levi had given him, with explicit instructions about keeping his fingers away from the blade. Nora was at the kitchen table. Levi was there, too, going through some papers ranch business, something about the South Pasture property line. With his reading glasses on, which Clara had only seen twice before, and which he seemed slightly self-conscious about, Nora had been watching him. Clara had been watching Nora watch him. Levi looked up, perhaps sensing the attention, and found Nora's eyes on him. He looked back at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't rush her. He just looked back, patient as stone, the way he'd looked at Molly on the platform. Nora said, "My father's hand shook at the end." The room got very still. Levi set down his papers. "Did they?" he said. "Not a question. A space for her to continue if she wanted to." He tried to hide it, Nora said. Her voice was perfectly level, the way it got when she was saying things that cost her. "He didn't want us to know how sick he was. But I knew. I was 8 and I knew." She paused. "Mama didn't tell me and Papa didn't tell me. They were trying to protect me. But I knew anyway, and then when he died, she stopped. Pressed her lips together for a second. I already knew, and somehow that was worse. Knowing and pretending I didn't know. Levi was very still. He had the ability, Clara had noticed, to become entirely present, without making any movement at all, no shifting. No reaching out, no filling the air with comfort words. He just received what Nora was saying. I'm sorry, he said. That's a heavy thing to carry for an 8-year-old. I'm 10 now, Nora said. I know you are. Nora looked at the table. Something in her face was doing battle with itself. I watch you, she said. Every day I watch how you are with Eli and Molly. And with Mama. And I keep waiting for it to change. I know you do, Levi said. She looked up sharply. You know, you're careful, he said. It's not a flaw. It's something you learned because you had to. He leaned back slightly in his chair. I had a brother who was the same way. He didn't trust easily. When he finally trusted someone, it was permanent. Couldn't shake it loose, even when it wasn't entirely deserved. Nora was quiet, absorbing this. What happened to him? Something crossed Levi's face, not dramatic, but real. The particular compression of someone touching an old wound carefully. He died young, Levi said. He and my youngest brother both. Fever. The word landed in the kitchen. Clara's hands went still in the dishwater. Nora sat very straight. How old were you? 14. Marcus was 11. Daniel was 8. Nora absorbed this with the serious focus of someone doing arithmetic. So you know what it's like to have people just disappear. Yes, Levi said. I do. Nora looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Clara, watching from the side of her vision, felt her own breathing go shallow. Then Nora said, quietly and with great precision, as if she were making a legal statement, I'm not saying I trust you yet, but I'm not as against it as I was. The ghost of something moved through Levi's expression. That's fair, he said. I'll let you know, Nora said. I'll be here, he said. Nora picked up her book. Levi picked up his papers. Clara turned back to the dishes, with her heart doing something in her chest that she decided not to examine too closely right now. From the porch, Eli's voice floated in. Can someone tell me if this looks like a horse or a potato? The tension broke. Nora almost laughed, actually almost. The closest she'd come to it in 6 weeks, and called back, It looks like a potato that fell downstairs. That's what I thought, Eli said gloomily. Levi looked at his papers and saw him press his lips together, and she understood that he was doing the same thing she was trying, not to let the moment be larger on the outside than it needed to be. She wrung out the dishcloth. She thought, something is happening in this house. She thought, I don't know yet if I'm ready for it. The weeks folded into each other, and October arrived and brought with it the smell of change, not just in the air but in the small textures of daily life on the Hart Ranch. The garden had to be put to bed for winter, and Clara spent 3 mornings doing it. And on the second morning, Nora came out unasked and knelt down in the dirt beside her and started pulling spent plants without comment. And they worked together for 2 hours in the cold air without needing to talk about it, which was its own kind of conversation. Eli had graduated, in Levi's estimation, to cleaning the tack without supervision. He reported this to Clara with the solemnity of someone announcing a military promotion. Clara told him it was wonderful and meant it, and also made him wash his hands 3 times before touching the bread. And then Molly got sick. It started on a Sunday slowly, the way childhood illness often does, with a quietness that wasn't Molly's particular kind of quiet, a stillness that was wrong, in the specific way that a mother recognizes before she can articulate it. Clara noticed at breakfast that Molly wasn't eating with her usual focused determination. She noticed at lunch that the girl's cheeks had a color that wasn't weather and wasn't warmth. By Sunday evening, she knew. She carried Molly upstairs and put her in bed, and sat beside her with her hand on her daughter's forehead, and the heat under her palm reached her across. Years reached her back through time to a sick room in Ohio, and James's face against the pillow, and she felt the familiar terror begin to climb in her chest. Before she could stop it, she pressed it back down. She was practical. She was capable. This was a child's fever, and children got fevers. She was down to the kitchen for cold water and a cloth when she heard Levi's boots on the stairs. Not his usual deliberate tread, something a little faster, because he'd apparently seen the lamp moving and known what it meant. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. Ma, Clara said without preamble. Fever. He didn't ask questions she hadn't answered. He said, how bad? Bad enough, she said. I don't know yet. Doc Pruitt is in town. His house is on the far end of Granger Street, past the mill. Can be there in 40 minutes. Clara looked at him. It's late. It's dark. Are roads I've been riding for 15 years, he said. She looked at him, at his face, at the uncomplicated readiness in it, at the complete absence of calculation or resentment, and felt something shift so hard inside her that she had to look away. Get the doctor, she said. He was gone before she finished saying it. She heard the barn, then hooves, then nothing. She carried the cold cloth upstairs and sat beside Molly in the lamplight and listened to her daughter breathe and thought about all the things she'd spent the last 6 weeks being careful about, and the way all that carefulness didn't mean anything in the particular kind of darkness that comes with a sick child and a man's writing in the night to get help. Nora appeared in the doorway. She had heard. How bad? She asked the same words Levi had used, which meant either that directness was universal or that her daughter had absorbed more of this man's language than Clara had noticed. I don't know, Clara said honestly. Nora came and sat on the other side of the bed. She didn't touch Molly. She just sat there, upright, watchful, the way she sat in all situations that required vigilance. He went for the doctor, Nora said. Yes, in the dark. Nora looked at Molly's face, flushed and too still, the way sick children go still, like they're concentrating on something, and said nothing else. They waited. It was the longest 40 minutes Clara had experienced since James died. Kept the cloth cool, rotating it, talking quietly to Molly when the girl surfaced into restless half-waking, pushing her back gently toward sleep. Nora sat across the bed like a small sentry and said nothing but refused to leave, and Clara didn't ask her to. Eli appeared once, in the doorway, saw the two of them at Molly's bedside, and backed away quietly. She heard him sit down on the top step of the stairs, just outside the door, keeping his own kind of watch. When she heard hooves in the yard and then boots on the porch, and voices Levi's low rumble, and an older, rougher voice, that must be the doctor, something in her chest, unclenched so fast it almost hurt. Doc Pruitt was 60-something, and moved like someone who had been dragged out of bed at odd hours enough times that he no longer had opinions about it. He came upstairs, examined Molly, asked Clara questions in a clipped and efficient manner, and then straightened up and told her it was a sharp fever, but not the kind with teeth, meaning not the kind that dug in and refused to let go. Rest, cool cloths, broth when she could take it. He'd check back in 2 days. He told Nora to stop looking at him like he was the enemy, and she looked away and didn't apologize. When he left, Levi walked him down. Clara heard them talking in low voices in the kitchen. Couldn't make out the words, heard the door, then heard Levi's boots on the stairs. He stopped in Molly's doorway. She was still sitting beside the bed. Nora was still across from her. Molly had finally settled into something closer, to real sleep, her breathing steadier, her face losing that terrible concentration. Doc says she'll be all right, Levy said quietly. I know, he told me. Clara looked at him, at his coat still on, his hat in his hand, mud on his boots from the dark road. You rode hard. He looked at Molly for a moment. She's 4 years old, he said. That was the whole explanation. Nora, from the other side of the bed, had been looking at him since he appeared in the doorway. Clara watched her daughter's face and saw the thing happening there, the thing she'd been watching Nora protect against for 6 weeks, the careful wall doing something it hadn't done before. Nora said very quietly, "Thank you." Levi looked at her. He nodded once, the specific nod of someone who understands that a thing has just cost something and doesn't want to make it cost more by making it into an occasion. Get some sleep, said. Both of you. He withdrew. Clara sat beside her daughter and listened to the house settle back into its nighttime rhythms. Levi moving through the kitchen, the sound of water, a lamp being turned down, then the quiet. She thought about the first letter she'd written. I have 3 children. I have had enough disappointment to last me a while. She thought about the man who had just ridden 40 minutes in the dark for a girl who was not his daughter. She thought about what Nora had said in the kitchen weeks ago. He was nice on the platform. But people are always nice at the beginning. She thought, this isn't the beginning anymore. She held Molly's hand in the lamp-dim room and listened to her breathe and allowed herself, cautiously, the smallest fraction of something that felt like relief that was larger than just the doctor's verdict. Molly improved by Tuesday, which was what Doc Pruitt had predicted and what Clara had made herself believe, while not entirely believing it until it was true. The fever broke Monday night. Clara was awake when it happened, felt the shift under her hand, and sat very still in the dark for a full minute, just listening to her daughter breathe. She did not cry. She had told herself she was done crying, and she mostly meant it. But she sat there in the dark for a long time before she lay back down. Levi had slept or attempted to in the chair outside Molly's door on Sunday night. Clara had found him there at 3 in the morning when she'd gone to the kitchen for more water, his long frame badly fitted to the chair, head tipped back, not quite asleep, but not quite awake either. She had looked at him for a moment in the lamplight. She hadn't said anything. She'd gone and gotten the water and gone back to Molly's room. She thought about it for a long time afterward. The image of him in that chair, not asked, not told, just there. She had spent 6 weeks cataloging Levi Hart's behaviors the way a scientist catalogs data objectively, carefully, refusing to draw conclusions until she had sufficient evidence. She understood the risks of that approach. She also understood the risks of the alternative. But a man who rode into the dark without being asked, and then slept badly in a chair in a hallway without making it into a statement that was a particular kind of evidence. By the time Molly was sitting up and asking for soup, the house had settled into a new shape, not dramatic, not announced, just different in the way rooms get different after something happens in them. The air altered, the furniture rearranged by invisible hands. Eli had taken it upon himself to bring Molly her meals and report to Levi twice a day on her condition, self-appointed, as if he'd been assigned the role of official correspondent. Levi received these reports seriously, asked appropriate questions, and thanked him. And Eli walked away from each exchange with the particular carriage of a boy who has been useful. Nora sat with Molly for hours, reading aloud, mostly which Molly loved and which Nora usually claimed to find tedious. Clara walked past the doorway on Wednesday afternoon and heard Nora's voice, steady and dramatic, doing different voices for different characters in a way that she would have absolutely refused to do for any adult, but performed without self-consciousness for a sick 4-year-old with Button on the beside her. Clara kept walking. She found Levi at the kitchen table that evening with his ranch papers, and she sat down from him for the first time without a specific reason, not to discuss something, not to report on Molly's status, just to sit. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." She looked at the table for a moment, organizing the words, because this was not a thing she wanted to get wrong. "When Molly got sick the first night, when you went for the doctor, I was afraid." She looked up at him. "Not just about Molly. That's not what I mean. I was afraid because I recognized it. Fear. It was the same kind I had when James was dying, and I've been carrying it since then. And when Molly's fever started, it came back exactly the same. And I thought," she stopped. "I thought, here is the moment I have been waiting for. Here is the moment when everything falls apart again." Levi listened. "But you went," she said, "without me asking, without making it a transaction. You just went." "She's a 4-year-old girl with a fever," he said. "There's no transaction in that." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. I know." He looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I've been not sure for 2 years. But I think I'm—" She searched for the word. "I think I'm less afraid than I was a week ago. That's something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When Marcus died, my brother, I wasn't there. I was in town. By the time I got back, it was already over. I've thought about that for 24 years. The not being there." He looked at the table. "So when there's a chance to be there, I go. That's all." Clara looked at his face, at the specific weight of 24 years in it, the kind of loss that doesn't diminish, just becomes part of the permanent geography. "Levi," she said quietly. He looked at her. She didn't say anything else for a moment. There were things she could have said, things that were true, and that she was beginning to know were true, and that she wasn't ready to say yet. But there was one thing she could say now, and she said it, plain and without performance, the way he'd taught her a thing could be said. "I'm glad you answered my letter," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face did the small, real thing it sometimes did when something mattered to him. "So am I," he said. Outside, the October wind moved through the darkness, and somewhere upstairs Molly was sleeping deeply, and Nora was reading, and Eli was badly carving a second attempt at a horse. The house was not quiet. It had not been quiet for 6 weeks. And Levi Hart sat at his kitchen table, in the middle of all that noise, in the middle of all that life, and looked like a man who had found something he'd stopped expecting to find. Clara watched him for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she stood up and said she was going to check on Molly, and went upstairs, and did not let herself think too much about the way the kitchen had felt in those last few minutes, because she was still a careful woman, and there was still a long way to go, and she had 3 children asleep upstairs who were counting on her to not get this wrong. She pressed her hand gently to Molly's forehead in the darkened room. Cool. She closed her eyes. She stood there in the dark and breathed. Molly was fully recovered by the end of the week, which Doc Pruitt confirmed on his second visit with the efficiency of a man who had seen enough childhood illness to recognize when a body had simply decided to be done with it. He looked her over, asked her to stick out her tongue, pressed 2 fingers against the glands in her neck, and announced she was fine in the particular tone doctors use when they mean it without ceremony. Molly responded by showing him Button. Doc Pruitt looked at the doll with the mismatched, repaired eye and said, "Nice stitching," without apparent irony, and left. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go and felt the particular unwinding that follows. A crisis resolved not joy exactly, more like the slow release of a breath held too long, the body remembering how to stop bracing. Behind her, through the front door, she could hear Molly's voice explaining something at length to Eli, who was responding in the patient monotone he used when he was only half listening, but didn't want to say so. The house had its noise back. Its particular noise, the specific combination of those 3 voices in those particular rooms that Clara had not known. She was learning as a sound until it went quiet during the sick days, and the absence of it had been its own kind of wrong. She stood on the porch a minute longer than she needed to. She was thinking about what she'd said to Levi 2 nights ago. "I'm glad you answered my letter." And the way he'd looked at her when he said it back. She had been sleeping on that exchange, turning it over in the dark hours when Molly still needed checking, examining it from different angles the way you examine something you found that might be valuable, or might be ordinary. And you can't yet tell which. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of, exactly. That was the honest answer. He let out a short, ugly laugh. She knew she felt something had known for weeks, had known precisely since the night he rode into the dark without being asked, but knowing you feel something, and knowing what to do with it were entirely different territories, and Clara Mercer had spent 2 years making decisions strictly on what she knew rather than what she felt. Because feelings had a habit of leading you somewhere expensive. She went inside and told Molly to put on her boots and they could go see the barn cats, and Molly was off the chair before Clara finished the sentence. Life resumed. The trouble with the Aldridge property came to a head in the second week of October, and it arrived at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in the form of Levi reading a letter, with an expression that Clara had not seen on him before. Not angry, not exactly, but the specific stillness of a man containing anger, because the alternative was worse. He put the letter down after a minute and looked at his coffee. "Problem?" Clara said. He looked up. The children were there, Eli, working through his oatmeal, Nora reading. Molly, engaged in a private conversation with Button and Levi, made a small decision with his eyes, which Clara read as not in front of them. "After," he said. She nodded. After meant when the children had dispersed, Eli to the barn, Nora to the upstairs room, where she'd claimed the window seat as her reading territory, Molly to the kitchen floor with a collection of smooth stones she'd been sorting by color for reasons she hadn't explained. Levi pushed the letter across the table to Clara. She read it. It was from a man named Rupert Aldridge, who owned the neighboring property to the south, the same south property that produced Levi's particular dark mood every time he came back from checking the fence line. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and had the formal politeness of something written by a man who was being ugly in legal language, so he could later say he had been civil. The substance of it was this. Aldridge claimed that the eastern boundary of his property extended 40 feet further north than the current fence line, which would put a significant portion of Levi's south grazing land inside Aldridge territory. He was requesting that Levi relocate the fence. He had attached what he described as a survey conducted by his own man. Clara read it twice. "He's claiming 40 feet, she said. 42, his survey says. That's your south grazing pasture." Most of it, Levi said. The part with the creek access. Part I use for the summer cattle rotation. She looked at the letter again. His survey is from this year, September. And yours? I had the property surveyed when I bought it, 15 years ago. He leaned back in his chair. I need to find it. Clara looked at him. You don't know where it is? He pressed his lips together, which was his version of admitting something he didn't particularly want to admit. I know it exists. I filed it with the county clerk when I registered the deed. What I don't know is whether I have a copy here or whether I need to go to Helena to get one. The county courthouse in Helena has the records? Should. How long would that take? 2 days riding. More with weather. He was looking at the letter with the expression of a man, calculating the cost of something. Aldridge has been pushing at that fence line for 3 years. Small things moving markers, grazing his cattle close to the line, once just outright cutting a section and claiming it was accident. But this, he touched the letter's edge. This is the first time he's put it in writing, which means he's decided to make it formal. Which means he's probably already spoken to someone in town. Clara set the letter down. What does that mean? It means he's building something, getting his version established before I can counter it. He looked at her. Aldridge owns 3 times what I do. He's got friends on the county commission. He's been trying to consolidate land in this valley for 10 years. Buying out smaller ranches, running pressure on the ones that don't want to sell. But you're not small, Clara said. No, but he'd rather I were. Levi picked up his coffee. I need to get to Helena. I need the original survey in my hand before he takes this to the commission. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How long can you wait before it becomes urgent? Not long. 2 weeks, maybe 3, before he moves formally. Then go, she said. He looked at her. I'd be gone 4 or 5 days. I know. The ranch has been running for 6 weeks with my help, she said, and you've shown me what needs daily attention. I can manage 5 days. She looked at him steadily. This is your land, Levi. The land you built 15 years. Go get the survey. He held her gaze for a moment with that particular quality of attention he gave things that mattered to him. And she understood that she had just said something he hadn't quite expected, not the practical help, but your land you built 15 years. The acknowledgement that she understood what was at stake and why. I'll leave Thursday, he said. I want to walk you through the barn routine before I go. And there's a neighbor, Walt Hennessy, 2 miles east. If anything goes wrong, you can send Eli. All right. He nodded once. Decision made, manner settled, moving on. Very Levi. Clara picked up the letter and read it one more time and felt, underneath the practical concern about the property and the trip and the management of 5 days alone, a separate and quieter anger at a man she'd never met who was trying to take something that had been built. Honest by someone who didn't deserve to have it taken. She put the letter down. What kind of man is Aldridge? She asked. Levi considered this. The kind who's never had to work for something and doesn't respect it in other people, he said. The kind who thinks wanting something is sufficient justification for taking it. Clara had known men like that, had been on the receiving end of that particular logic more than once in 2 years of widowhood. Get the survey, she said. Levi left Thursday morning before light, which meant Clara was up before the children and standing on the porch with a lantern watching him load his saddlebags. The air was sharp, properly cold now, the kind that promised a hard winter, and her breath made small clouds. He stopped at the porch steps before mounting. I'll be back by Tuesday at the latest, he said. We'll be here, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the focused quality that meant he was thinking something he was deciding whether to say. You'll be all right, he said. Not a question. I've been all right in worse circumstances, she said. I know you have. He looked at the house behind her, at the dark windows, the sleeping children inside. Something in his face was doing the quiet thing it did when something mattered to him. And he wasn't going to make a speech about it. Take care of them. I always do, she said. He nodded, mounted, and rode out. She watched the lantern light of his departing figure until the dark swallowed it. The horse's hooves were muffled on the frost-hardened ground, and then there was just tumult and the house behind her with its sleeping inhabitants. She stood there a moment longer. She thought, 5 days. She thought, I've kept 3 children alive for 2 years. I can manage a ranch for 5 days. She went inside and started the stove. The first 2 days were fine. The barn routine that Levi had walked her through was manageable. The feeding, The water, the check on the livestock, the specific sequence he'd established over years that moved efficiently if you followed it. Eli was her right hand in it, which she'd counted on. And he rose to the responsibility with a seriousness that made her chest ache a little, because he was so much like James in that way, James at his best. James, before the sickness took the steadiness out of him. Nora ran the house with her. Not asked, not assigned, she simply appeared in the mornings and did the things that needed doing, with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Clara wondered sometimes what Nora would have been if she'd had the childhood she deserved, the one where the ground stayed solid and adults didn't die and she'd been able to spend a few more years not knowing how to manage things. Something formidable, probably. Something remarkable. She was already both of those things. She'd just paid for them too early. Molly followed Clara like a shadow, fully recovered, absolutely unbothered by the cold, wanting to know the name of every animal in the barn and requiring answers even when Clara didn't have them. Clara invented names when necessary. Molly accepted all of them with equal seriousness. The third day was when the problem arrived. Came in the form of two men on horseback who appeared at the end of the ranch road in the late afternoon, riding slowly the way men ride when they want to be seen and have time for you to think about what their arrival might mean. Clara was at the garden fence doing the last winterizing work, and she saw them before they reached the yard. She took her time standing up. She took her time putting down her garden fork. She did not go toward them, or away from them. She just stood where she was and waited, because she had learned that in situations where you didn't yet know what you were dealing with, the person who moved first gave up information. They pulled up at the yard's edge. Two men, both dressed better than working cowboys, which told her something. The one in front was perhaps 50, with a square face, and the particular ease of a man who spent a lot of time expecting to get what he wanted. She knew without being told. Aldridge. "Ma'am," he said with the courtesy that was really just a form of sizing someone up. "I'm looking for Levi Hart." "He's away," she said. "Away." He said it with the slight pause of someone noting useful information. "When do you expect him back?" "When he's done with his business," she said. Aldridge looked at her with the assessing look men use on women they haven't decided the category for yet. She looked back without helping him decide. "You're the wife?" he said. "I'm Clara Hart," she said, because she wasn't Clara Mercer anymore in any practical sense. And she wasn't going to stand in her own yard and let a man like this think she was something easily moved. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Well, Mrs. Hart, I'd like to leave a message for your husband if I might." "You can leave it with me," she said. "I'll see he gets it." He looked at her for a moment, and she understood that he was recalculating had arrived, expecting to do business with Levi Hart, and found instead a woman with a garden fork and a level expression. "The matter of the south boundary," he said. "I expect Hart's gotten my letter." "I believe he has," she said. "Then you know the situation." "I know your version of it," she said, which was precise and deliberate, and she watched it land. Aldridge's expression didn't change dramatically, he was too experienced for that, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "The survey speaks for itself," he said. "So does ours," she said. "The one filed with the county clerk 15 years ago." A silence. Brief. She watched him recalibrate. "There may be some discrepancy between surveys," he said, the formal pleasant tone returning like a coat he'd put back on. "I'd hope we can settle successfully between neighbors." "I'd hope so too," Clara said. "Levi Hart is a reasonable man. So is any man who comes to a conversation with accurate documents." Aldridge looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to meet resistance in this particular form and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "I'll come back when Hart returns," he said. "He'll be glad to speak with you," Clara said. "Bring your survey. He'll have his." Aldridge held her gaze for one more second, long enough to make it meaningful, which she returned without blinking, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was technically polite and practically a dismissal, turned his horse and rode out with his companion trailing. Clara stood at the garden fence and watched them go. Then she picked up her garden fork and stood there for a minute, letting her pulse settle, because she had been calm through all of that with considerable effort, and the effort had used something up. She heard the back door and Nora's voice. "Mama? Who were those men?" Clara turned. Nora was at the door, Eli just behind her, both of them with the focused expressions that meant they'd been watching from inside. Neighbor with a property question, Clara said. It's handled. Nora looked at her with the expression she used when she knew she was getting a simplified version, but was choosing not to argue about it. Was that Aldridge? Eli asked. Clara looked at her son. What do you know about Aldridge? Levi told me, Eli said, with the natural ease of Levi that Clara registered and filed. He said Aldridge has been pushing on the south fence, and that he's the kind of man who mistakes money for being right. Clara considered what that meant that Levi had talked to Eli about it, had trusted a 7-year-old with the unvarnished version, which meant he trusted Eli's ability to understand it, which meant he saw Eli more clearly than Clara sometimes let herself see, which meant she stopped following that line of thought. Go inside, she said. It's cold. She wrote Levi a letter that evening and gave it to Walt Hennessy's eldest boy to carry into town where it could go out with the next courier. She kept it brief because she didn't know where he was exactly, and brief was more likely to reach him. She told him about Aldridge's visit, what was said, how it ended. She told him to get the survey and come home. She put the pen down and looked at the word home on the paper. She had not used that word to mean this place before. She left it and folded the letter. Levi came back Monday, a day early, which meant either that Helena had yielded the documents faster than expected, or he'd pushed the return. She heard the horse in the yard late afternoon when she was starting supper, and she heard Eli shout something, and she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. He was still in the saddle when Eli reached him, talking fast, delivering the report he'd apparently been composing since Aldridge's visit. Levi listened with his hat still on, and his saddlebags across the horse, and his eyes moved from Eli to Clara in the doorway, and she gave him one nod that meant all is well, and he gave her one back that meant received. He was off the horse and handing the reins to Eli inside a minute, and Eli took them with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become a thing he just did, and Levi came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. The survey? She said. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded document. County clerk had it. Original survey, filed and stamped, February 1868. The boundary line Aldridge is claiming doesn't exist. His voice was level, but underneath it, something that had been drawn tight for 2 weeks was loosened. His fence is 23 feet inside his own property. Not mine. His Clara looked at him. He knew that. He knew that. He was hoping you didn't have the document. He was hoping, Levi agreed. Or that enough time had passed that disputing, it would cost more than yielding. Clara thought about the man on the horse at the yard's edge. The precise calibration of his courtesy, the way he'd looked at her as a variable in a problem he was trying to solve. He came here while you were gone because he thought a woman alone would be easier to lean on, she said. Levi looked at her steadily. Was he right? She met his gaze. What do you think? Something settled in his face. I think he probably got more than he expected. He's coming back to speak with you, she said. When he does, I'd like to be there. He looked at her for a moment with the complete attention he gave things he was deciding about. All right, he said. She turned back inside to the supper that was still on the stove. It's good that you're back, she said. She went, because it was simply true, and she had decided that there was no good reason not to say things that were simply true. She heard him behind her, boots on the floorboards, the particular sound of him in the house that she had, apparently without deciding to, learned as the sound of everything being in the right place. Aldridge came back on Thursday, as Levi had expected. This time with a third man, someone who carried himself like a lawyer, which he turned out to be. They met in the front room, which Clara had decided on, because the front room was the formal room, and formal rooms were about establishing terms. She had tea on the table, which was not hospitality, but rather a statement that this conversation was going to be conducted at a certain level of civility, regardless of what Aldridge intended. Levi sat across from Aldridge. Clara sat beside Levi. Aldridge looked at her placement with a particular expression that lasted less than a second before his professional courtesy closed over it. His lawyer, a man named Ferris, who wore good boots in bad faith, had papers in a leather case that he arranged on the table with deliberate care. I appreciate you receiving us, Aldridge said. Of course, Levi said, and put the original survey on the table. The county clerk's stamp, the date, the boundary lines. Clear as print could be. Ferris looked at it. Something shifted in the way he was sitting. Aldridge's expression did not change. He was, Clara had decided, a man who had spent decades not letting his expression change when things went wrong, because letting it change cost something. There may be historical errors in older surveys, Ferris said, with the smoothness of someone who had prepared this response. There may be, Levi said. There's also an 1,868 county record and a 2,000-acre deed that match this survey exactly. I'm happy to put both against your September document in front of the county commission. A silence. Clara watched Aldridge. She was interested in what a man like that looked like when he understood that the approach he'd counted on wasn't going to work. He looked mostly like a man doing arithmetic, calculating cost against alternative. There may be room for an accommodation, Aldridge said. The word accommodation was doing a lot of work. What kind of accommodation? Levi said. The creek access you use for summer rotation, I'd be willing to discuss an easement arrangement that would give us both fair access to the water. Clara heard what this was, a retreat that tried to present itself as a negotiation. A man who had arrived to take something leaving with a request for shared use of a thing he'd never had to. She watched Levi. He sat with the document on the table, and he took his time, the way he always took his time with things that required it. He was not going to be rushed, and both men across the table from him understood that. No, Levi said. Aldridge blinked. Barely. The creek is on Heartland, Levi said. It has been on Heartland for 15 years. That's not a negotiation, mister. Aldridge, it's a document. He put his hand flat on the survey. You're welcome to take this dispute to the county commission. I'll bring the deed, the original survey, and the clerk's record. You're also welcome to take it to the territorial court. I'll do the same. He looked at Aldridge steadily. Or you can go home and leave my fence line where it is. The room was quiet. Ferris looked at his papers without looking at them. Aldridge looked at Levi with the expression of a man who was reassessing not just the land dispute, but the person across from him, the person he had perhaps underestimated for 3 years, while pushing at a fence line and moving markers and cutting sections and calling it accident. Then Aldridge looked at Clara. She looked back. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She just held his gaze, with the same level expression she'd given him at the garden fence, and let him understand that she was here, and she was staying, and the person he was dealing with was not Levi Hart alone. Aldridge looked back at Levi. We'll see ourselves out, he said. He and Ferris left. Clara and Levi sat at the table for a moment after the front door closed. She could hear Aldridge's horses in the yard, then the sound of them leaving, diminishing, gone. Levi looked at the survey on the table. He folded it carefully and set it aside. He'll try something else eventually, he said. Probably, Clara said, but not today. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before or had seen in traces, in fragments, and was now seeing all at once. You didn't have to sit in on that, he said. I know I didn't have to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he looked at you at the end, you know what he was seeing. He was seeing that you're not alone, she said, and that whoever you're with isn't going to be a softer approach. That's right, Levi said. She stood up and gathered the tea things because her hands needed something to do. Levi, she said. He looked at her. This was the moment. She knew it was the moment because she had been carrying something for weeks, not since Molly's fever, not since the barn doorway conversation, not since any single thing, but since the accumulation of all of it, slow weight of evidence she'd been filing. The careful case she'd been building against her own resistance. She was not an impulsive woman. She had never, in her adult life, walked into something she hadn't thought through. She had thought this through. I've been afraid, she said, since before I answered your advertisement. I've been afraid the whole way here and every day since. Not of you. She set the tea tray down. Of wanting something too much. Of letting my children get attached to something that might. She stopped. You know what might. I know, he said quietly. I keep waiting, she said, to see the moment you realize it's too much, that we're too much. 3 children, no money, a land dispute with the neighbor, a wife who rearranges your pantry and interrogates you about your motives, and she stopped again. I keep waiting for the expiration date on this. Levi stood up from his chair. He was not a man who moved toward people without reason, and he moved now not quickly. Not with drama, just with the deliberate certainty he gave all his movements, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. Clara, he said, her name in his mouth. In that particular low way he said it when something mattered. I have been alone in this house for 6 years. I want to tell you something about that. She waited. It wasn't the quiet, he said. Everyone assumes a man alone gets used to the quiet. Quiet was fine. It was the he searched, which was unusual for him, because he usually said exactly what he meant the first time. It was setting 2 chairs at the table and only using one. It was fixing something on the roof and having no one to tell that it was fixed. It was building this place for 15 years and not knowing what it was for. He looked at her steadily. And then your letter arrived. And you said, I have 3 children, and I have had enough disappointment to last me a while. And I read that twice, and I thought that is a person who is telling me the truth. Clara's throat tightened in a way she did not allow herself to show. I have not once, since you came down those platform steps, he said, thought any of you were too much. I have thought, more than once, that I don't deserve this much. That's different. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him. You didn't bring me a burden, he said. You brought the noise back. You brought footsteps on the stairs. He stopped. A muscle worked in his jaw. I heard Eli laugh in the barn last week. Just laughing at something. One of the horses did something funny. I don't even know what. And I thought I haven't heard that sound in this place since I was young. Since Daniel was alive. He looked at her. That's not something I can put a price on. Clara Mercer, who had not cried at James's grave after the first time, who had kept herself assembled through 'tis of difficulty by the sheer force of having no alternative, who had taught herself not to want things too specifically, so the losing of them would hurt less, felt something in her chest break open with the clean completeness of something that had been under pressure a long time. She did not cry. She took one breath, slow and deliberate. Then she said, I'm not afraid of you. I know you're not, he said. I'm afraid of being wrong. I've been wrong before, about what would hold. I know that too. She looked at him. What if I stop waiting, she said, for the expiration date? What if I just stop doing that? His face did the small, real thing. Then I'd say, he said carefully, that would suit me fine. She stood in the kitchen of the Hart Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in October and made a decision. Not the impulsive kind, not the kind born from fear or desperation, or the practical pressure of a 14-day eviction notice. The kind you cake when you've watched a person long enough to know what they are when no one is performing anything. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the table. His hand turned over and held hers, rough and certain. From upstairs, Molly's voice, Mama. Eli says he carved a horse, but it still looks like a potato. From slightly further away, Eli's voice, It's getting better. One end is definitely pointier. Levi's mouth curved. Clara looked up at him and did not stop herself from smiling. I should go see about the horse, she said. Probably, he said, and didn't let go of her hand for another moment. She went upstairs to adjudicate the potato horse. Behind her, she heard him exhale, long and quiet, and entirely different from the way he breathed in an empty house, because she had learned that sound too, and this was not it, and she understood. Without looking back, what she heard was a man who had stopped waiting for something. He'd half convinced himself was finished. She walked upstairs. The house made noise all around her. The potato horse ended up on the kitchen windowsill. Eli had presented it to Levi the following morning with the careful casualness of someone who wanted very much to know what the other person thought, but needed to appear indifferent to the answer. It was objectively not a horse. It was a wedge of wood with one end carved to a rough point and 2 lumps on the underside that were meant to be front legs and had not entirely succeeded. Levi had picked it up, turned it in his hands with genuine attention, and said that the proportions were improving and that the back end needed more work, but the head was getting there. Eli had absorbed this assessment with a straight face and a brightness in his eyes that he was working hard to control. It should be on the sill, Levi said, where it can look out. So that's where it went, between the salt jar and the edge of the curtain facing the yard. Molly approved. Nora said nothing, which in Nora's language meant she approved too. Clara watched all of this from the stove and thought about what it meant that a badly carved piece of wood on a windowsill could make her feel the way she felt, which was something she didn't have a clean word for, something warmer than relief and more complicated than happiness, something that lived in the specific between this is real and I am still afraid to trust that it is. She was working on the afraid part. She was doing it deliberately, the way she did most things with intention, without pretending the difficulty wasn't there. Levi had asked her something the week before, quietly, after the children were in bed, and the Aldridge business had been set aside, and they were sitting in the kitchen, in the particular ease they'd developed over weeks, ease of two people who had stopped needing to fill silences and had started being comfortable inside them. He'd said, "What are you waiting for still?" She'd looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I watch you," he said, "the same way Nora watches. Like you're waiting for something to go wrong." He wasn't accusing. He was just naming a thing he'd observed. "I want to know what I can do about it." She'd been quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Nothing. I don't think you can do anything. I think it's something I have to undo in myself." She looked at her hands. "James and I were happy. And then he was sick. And then he was gone. And everything I thought was solid just wasn't. And I've been treating solid things as temporary ever since because it's safer." "Is it?" She looked up at him. "Treating solid things as temporary," he said. "Has that made any of the hard parts easier?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It's just made the good parts harder to have." He nodded once. "Then maybe it's not safer, just more familiar." She had sat with that for a week, turned it over, found it true from every angle she examined it from. The thing she'd been calling caution was not, in any precise sense, protection. It was habit. It was the grooved track her thinking had worn into itself over 2 years of survival mode. And survival mode had its uses, but the situation had changed, and her thinking had not caught up yet. She was catching it up now, deliberately, every morning. The way you work a stiff joint with intention and some discomfort, and the knowledge that the discomfort was the process working. November came in cold and direct, the way Montana months did, without a great deal of preamble. The first hard freeze arrived on a Tuesday night, and Eli discovered it Wednesday morning when he went to the water pump and had to come back for the kettle to thaw it out, which he did without complaint and with the competence of someone who had been taught exactly this procedure. He came back inside with red hands and went straight to the stove. "Pump's frozen," he reported. "I know," Clara said. "Did you thaw it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She poured him coffee, weak coffee, more milk than anything, which was Eli's version, though he insisted it was real coffee, and she had stopped arguing about it. "Go tell Levi the water trough in the east paddock will need checking." Eli took the coffee and went back out, and Clara listened to his boots on the porch and across the yard, and thought about the distance between the child who had sat at a breakfast table in a rented room with a bruised look in his eyes, and the boy who now moved through a Montana ranch in. A hard freeze with a purposefulness that belonged to someone who knew where he fit. That distance wasn't nothing. That distance was everything. Nora was at the kitchen table with her schoolwork. Clara had started formal lessons 2 weeks into their arrival, partly because Nora needed it, and partly because routine was its own kind of foundation, and Nora attacked schoolwork with the same focused intensity she attacked everything. She was, Clara suspected, ahead of her age level in reading and behind in arithmetic because she found arithmetic boring and had not developed the patience for things she found boring, which was a solvable problem, and one Clara was working on. "What's 13 times 17? Clara said. Nora looked up with the expression she used for arithmetic. "Why? Because I'm asking." A pause. 221. "Show me the work." A longer pause, more significant. The kind that meant she'd done it in her head and now was deciding whether she wanted to argue about the work-showing requirement. "Nora." The paper came out. The work got shown. Clara went back to the bread she was kneading. There was a specific pleasure in this, in the ordinary machinery of a morning, in knowing where everyone was and what they were doing, in the small arguments about arithmetic, and the sound of boots on cold ground, and the smell of bread starting to go golden. She had not let herself feel this pleasure too fully for a long time, because pleasure was a thing that could be lost. And the habit of not letting herself have things too fully had been so complete that she'd barely noticed it was happening. She noticed it now. She was choosing to notice it. She pressed the bread dough with the heel of her hand and thought, "I am here. I am warm. My children are in the next room and the yard. The man in this house is a good man." She made herself let those things be true without qualifying them, without adding for now or so far or as long as it lasts. They were true right now. Right now was enough to work with. It was Nora who brought up the question of the wedding, and she did it with the directness that was Nora's defining quality, not cruel, never cruel. but completely without the social softening that most people applied to sensitive subjects. She did it at supper, in November, on a Wednesday, when the four of them and Levi were all at the table, and the lamp was going, and outside the temperature had dropped to something serious. She looked at Levi and said, without preamble, "Are you and Mama going to get married?" The table went quiet in the specific way. Tables go quiet when a 10-year-old says the thing the adults have been carefully not saying. Eli looked at his plate. Molly looked at Nora with the open fascination of someone watching a very interesting event. Levi looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nora. "That's a conversation for adults," Clara said. "I'm asking because I want to know," Nora said. "Not because I'm being rude." "I know you're not being rude. Then can someone answer?" Clara looked at Levi. He was watching her with the patience he always had. The kind that didn't press but didn't retreat either. She looked back at Nora. "We haven't decided yet," she said, which was honest. Nora absorbed this. "Are you going to decide?" "Yes," Clara said. Nora nodded. She picked up her fork. All right, she went back to eating. Molly, who had been watching all of this with the solemn attention of a small judge, turned to Levi and said, "If you get married, can I put flowers on Button?" Levi looked at her for a moment. "That seems like an important part of the proceedings," he said seriously. Molly nodded, satisfied, and returned to her supper. Eli had not looked up through any of this. He was pushing food around his plate with the expression of someone having an internal conversation he didn't want visible. Later, when supper was finished and Molly had been put to bed and Nora had gone upstairs with her book, Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway while Clara was washing dishes, and Levi was at the table going through the month's accounts. He stood there for a moment. "Eli," Clara said without turning. "Whatever it is, just say it." A pause. "Then do you want to?" he said. "Marry him?" Clara turned around. Her son was standing in the doorway, with his hands in his pockets, trying very hard to look like the answer didn't matter to him. "Come here," she said. He came and sat at the table across from Levi, who had set his accounts down and was waiting, without making it into a performance. "Yes," Clara said simply. "I do." Eli looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Levi. Something in his 7-year-old face was working very hard, sorting through something, and Clara watched it happen and did not hurry him. "My papa," Eli said carefully. He was good. He wasn't always there the way I needed, but he was good." "He sounds like it," Levi said. "I don't want to forget him," Eli said. If we all..." He couldn't quite finish the sentence. Levi leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Eli," he said, "I'm not asking you to forget your father. I'm not even asking you to think of me the same way. Those are two different things, and they can both be true at the same time." Eli looked at him. "Your father was your father," Levi said. "That doesn't move. What I'd like to be is someone who's also there. Not instead." Also, Eli sat very still. He said at last quietly, "Okay," Levi said. Eli got up from the table and went to bed without another word, which was precisely how Eli handled things that went deep. He said the necessary thing and then removed himself before he had to feel it in front of anyone, which was, Clara thought, a very James Mercer trait that she had apparently passed on through example. She stood at the sink for a moment after he left. "He'll be all right," Levi said. "I know," she said. "He's been all right through worse." She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Levi Hart at his kitchen table in November lamplight, a man who had just told her 7-year-old son, not instead, also with a steadiness that required no rehearsal because it was simply what he believed. "I want to get married before winter sets in hard," she said. "Not a large thing. Just the justice of the peace in town and whatever the children want to do about it." He looked at her. "December?" "December," she said. He nodded. "December." She pushed off the counter. "Go finish your accounts." He picked up his papers. She walked past him toward the stairs, and his hand came out and caught hers briefly, as she passed, not stopping her, just the contact, just the acknowledgement, and she squeezed once and let go and went upstairs. She stopped outside Nora's door. She knocked. "Come in," Nora said. She was in bed with the lamp on and her book open, and she looked at Clara with the expression she used when she was waiting to see what something was going to be. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "December," she said. Nora looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Another moment. Something in Nora's face was doing a complicated thing that Clara recognized as feeling crossing the border into expression before Nora could stop it. "Okay," Nora said. She looked at her book. I want to pick the flowers. For Button or for the ceremony? Both. Clara looked at her daughter, this person she had made. This serious, fierce, careful person who had carried more than any child should and was still, underneath all that carefulness, 10-year-old girl who wanted to pick flowers for her mother's wedding. Then you'll pick the flowers, Clara said. She kissed her forehead and went to bed. The wedding happened on the 14th of December, which was a Thursday, which Levi said was a fine day for it, which Clara had not argued about because she had no strong opinions about which day of the week a wedding should happen, and Levi apparently did. The justice of the peace was a man named Borden, who had a large gray mustache and the tired benevolence of someone who had performed this particular service enough times that it had become a thing he did, cleanly and without fuss. He came to the ranch house because Levi had asked him to, which Clara had not expected, and which meant the ceremony happened in the front room of the Hart Ranch with the November light coming through the windows and 3 children as the only witnesses. Molly had Button, who wore a ring of dried prairie flowers around her yarn hair neck, which Nora had made the previous evening with total seriousness, while claiming she wasn't going to any trouble. Eli stood very straight, which he did when he was feeling something he didn't want to show. Nora stood next to Eli. She held a small bouquet of the last of the season's dried wildflowers, which she'd found and preserved weeks ago without telling anyone. She presented them to Clara that morning at breakfast, and said they were for her to hold during the ceremony. And Clara had taken them without making a speech about it, because that was what Nora needed. Borden read the necessary words. Levi said his. Clara said hers. They were not elaborate vows. Neither of them were elaborate people. They said what was required, and meant it completely, and that was sufficient. When Borden said the thing about the ring, Levi produced a plain gold band from his vest pocket, not extravagant, not cheap, just solid and clean, and put it on Clara's hand with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she felt the weight of it settle on her finger like something that hadn't always been supposed to be there and had simply taken a while to arrive. She did not cry. Molly cried briefly, from emotion she couldn't have named, and then stopped when Button's flower crown slipped sideways and required immediate attention. Eli shook Levi's hand afterward with the formal gravity of a man conducting official business. Nora waited until Borden had packed his papers and left, and Levi had gone to the kitchen to start the celebratory supper he'd been planning for 3 days. And then she went to Clara and stood in front of her with the expression she'd worn since birth, when she was arriving at a decision she'd been working toward for a long time. "I'm glad," she said. Clara looked at her. "I'm glad you answered the letter," Nora said. "I'm glad we came. I'm glad it's him." She said it all in one rush, the way Nora delivered things that cost her fast, before the door could close. "I just wanted you to know." Clara put her arms around her oldest daughter, who stiffened for half a second the way she always did, and then let herself be held, the way she always did when she decided it was permitted. "I know," Clara said into her hair. "I'm glad too." The first winter on the Hart Ranch was hard in the way Montana winters were hard, not personal, not punishing, just enormous and indifferent, and requiring constant attention, and the acceptance that certain days would simply be difficult, and there was nothing to do but move through them. The water pump froze twice more. The cattle on the south pasture needed extra feed through January when the grass was buried deep. A section of the barn roof developed a leak that Levi repaired in weather that Clara thought should have made it impossible. Coming in afterward, with hands so cold she made him hold them over the stove for 10 minutes before she was satisfied. "I've worked in worse," he said. "That isn't the point," she said. He submitted to the stove, which she understood was his version of yielding to reasonable argument. Eli learned, over the course of that winter, how to handle the horses in cold weather, the specific adjustments to routine, the way their behavior changed, the particular attention required when the temperature dropped hard and fast. He learned it the way children learn things that come from someone they trust and want to emulate, which is to completely, and without having to be reminded. By February, he had the morning barn check, alone while Levi dealt with the cattle, efficiency of someone, and he did it internalize the point of it, rather than just the steps. Levi told Clara, without particular fanfare, that Eli had a real feel for it. Clara received this information with a composed expression that she maintained until she was alone in the kitchen, and then she let herself feel the size of it for a full minute before she composed herself again and went back to the bread. Nora's arithmetic improved. This was partly Clara's persistence, and partly the fact that Levi, who turned out to have a dry, practical head for numbers, started sitting with her at the table on winter evenings and working through problems in a way that was less about instruction and more about two people thinking through something together. He didn't tell her it was important. He just made it interesting, which was more effective than important with Nora. She still maintained the particular Nora formality with him, the slightly measured quality, the distance that was narrowing, but narrowing slowly on her own terms. Called him Mr. Hart. He did not ask her to call him anything else. Clara watched this and understood that he was once again doing what he'd done on the platform with Molly, making himself available and patient, and letting the timing be whatever it needed to be. Molly had no such complications. Molly had decided, sometime around the fever, that Levi was simply part of the permanent furniture of her world, and she treated him accordingly, following him to the barn, demanding explanations for things, bringing him objects for his opinion with the complete confidence of a child who expects to be taken seriously. He always took her seriously. She started calling him Pa sometime in January, not as a declaration, just casually, the way you call someone what they are. Pa the cat has 3 kittens now. Pa, Eli says I can't have coffee, but you have coffee in the morning. Levi accepted this without comment, the way he accepted most things that mattered completely, and without making an occasion of it. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard Molly say it the first time, and she set down whatever she was holding and stood still for a moment and breathed. Just breathed. March brought the Aldridge resolution, which arrived not as a confrontation but as a letter, which was, Clara thought, precisely the shape a retreat takes when it happens in the language of the formal, the way Aldridge did everything. The letter informed Levi that a review of the property surveys in question had confirmed the original boundary as registered in 1868, and that Mr. Aldridge considered the matter closed. No apology. No acknowledgement that he'd spent 3 years pushing at a line he knew wasn't his. Just the withdrawal, framed as a mutual resolution. Levi read it at breakfast and put it down without ceremony. It's over? Clara said. It's over, he said. Eli looked up from his oatmeal. What did he say? He said the boundary stands, Levi said. Eli's expression went through something satisfaction and a kind of vindication that he was too young to name, but clearly felt. Because you had the survey, he said. Because we had the survey, Levi said, and looked at Clara when he said it. She met his eyes and held them for a second, and then went back to her tea. She thought about Aldridge on the horse at the yard's edge, looking at her as a variable, in a calculation, looking for something softer, something alone, something more easily moved. She thought about the particular way. Certain people looked at a woman without a man beside her and saw something they thought they could work with. She had a man beside her now, but she'd been the one standing in the yard. She'd been the one who held that conversation and didn't yield an inch. And it was the combination that Aldridge had found. In the end, not worth the cost, not the survey alone, not the man alone, but both together, steady as the boundary line itself. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to be part of something solid after 2 years of being a movable piece in other people's calculations. She turned back to the stove. She thought, this is mine. This is ours. I did not stumble into this. I chose it with open eyes. It was a different feeling than relief. It was something older and quieter and more permanent. Spring came to the Hart Ranch the way spring came everywhere imperfectly. In fits, a warm week followed by a hard frost, followed by 3 days of rain, followed by a morning that smelled exactly like what was coming. Clara started the garden again in April, working the earth that had been sleeping under snow. And Nora came out on the second morning, the same way she had the previous autumn, without being asked. Kneeling down in the mud, pulling spent matter from the beds with the focused attention she gave things she'd decided to care about. They worked in the cool morning air without talking for a while. Then Nora said, without looking up from the bed she was working, I've been thinking about something. What have you been thinking about? Clara said, Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, not at Clara, which meant it was something she needed side-eye distance for. I've been thinking about what it means to trust someone, she said. Like actually trust them, not just, she picked at the edge of her glove, not just deciding to trust them, but when it becomes real. Clara waited. "'Cause I decided to trust you," Sora said, "when I was small. And that was just, it was something I knew. But with him," she didn't say the name, which meant she was still working out what the name should be. "With Levi, it happened differently. It was more like I kept watching and waiting to be wrong, and then at some point I realized I'd stopped waiting. And I don't know exactly when that was." Clara looked at her daughter. "That's what trust actually is," she said. "I think. The other kind, the kind you decide, that's faith. Trust is what happens after enough evidence." Nora considered this. "You had to decide first," she said. "I had to decide to stay open," Clara said. "That's different from trusting." That was the harder part. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He sat with me last Tuesday, when I couldn't get the long division. He didn't tell me the answer. He just sat there until I worked it out myself." She paused. "And then he said the answer was right, and went back to his accounts." "I know," Clara said. "That's—" Nora stopped. "I don't know the word for what that is." "Patient," Clara said. "More than that. Respectful," Clara said. "He respects how your mind works." Nora was quiet for a long moment. "I want to call him something," she said. "Not Mr. Hart anymore." Clara said nothing. She kept her hands in the soil and said nothing, and let Nora have the space she needed. "Not Pa," Nora said. "That's Molly's word." She didn't finish. "What's between Mr. Hart and Papa?" Nora said. Clara thought about it. "You'll know it when it comes," she said. Nora nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and went back to the garden bed. 2 weeks later at the supper table, Nora said something to Levi and called him Father. Not Papa, not Pa, Father precise and chosen and permanent. Levi looked up from his plate. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him with the steady Nora directness, not flinching from the weight of what she'd said. He nodded once. And then he looked down at his plate and pressed his lips together for a moment and said, "Pass the bread," to Eli, because that was what the moment needed, not a speech, not a scene, just the bread getting passed, and the meal continuing, and the word she'd used hanging in the air of the room, like something that had always been there and had simply found its way home. Clara passed the bread. Eli didn't say anything, which meant he'd heard it and was feeling it quietly in the way he felt everything important. Molly said father is a longer word than Pa, with the academic interest of a 5-year-old sorting out language. "It is," Levi said. "I like Pa better," Molly said. "I know you do," Levi said, and that was all. The summer the children would remember, years later, when they were grown and the ranch had changed, in the way ranches do over decades, and the people in it had changed with. It was the summer of that first full year, when everything that had been tentative became solid. Eli spent most of it in the barn and the pasture, and could by August do things with horses that boys twice his age couldn't do. And he did them with a competence that was entirely his own, built on the foundation of someone who had believed he could. He was not James Mercer's boy showing promise. He was Eli, who knew horses, who woke up in the mornings with purpose and fell asleep at night, having spent himself fully on things that mattered. Nora read everything she could get her hands on, and argued with Levi about half of it across the kitchen table in the evenings, and Levi argued back with genuine interest, and Clara sat nearby and listened to her daughter being taken seriously by a man who didn't require her to be smaller to be comfortable, and thought about what that would make her someday, what that was already making her. Molly turned 5 in July. She had developed opinions about the barn cats that were detailed and specific, and that she reported to Levi with the frequency of dispatches from the field. He received them all with the same grave attention. She had stopped carrying Button everywhere. Button lived on the windowsill now, beside Eli's carved horse, but she still brought her to bed at night, still pressed the doll's worn face against her cheek in the last minutes before sleep. Clara saw her do it one evening in July, passing the doorway with the lamp. She stopped. Molly was almost asleep, Button tucked under her chin, eyes drowsy and unfocused. "Mama," she said, without quite opening her eyes fully. "Go to sleep," Clara said. "Is everybody here?" Clara stood in the doorway. "Yes," she said, "everybody's here." Molly's eyes closed. Clara stood there a moment longer in the lamplight, looking at her youngest daughter's sleeping face. at the doll with the mismatched button eyes and the imperfect stitches on the repaired arm, 3 small stitches in dark thread. Not fine work. The work of a man who didn't sew doing it carefully because it needed doing. She thought about the 14-day eviction notice. She thought about the train platform and the worn trunk and 3 children behind her, and a man she'd never met standing at the far end of the platform with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her arrive. She thought about all the ways it could have gone wrong and didn't. She thought about the ways it still wasn't perfect, because it wasn't perfect, would never be, because imperfect was the only honest version of anything real. There were still hard mornings, still days when the weight of what she'd been through sat heavily and the old habit of waiting for things to break tried to reassert itself. Levi had bad days too, days when something in him went distant and closed, days he came in from the south pasture with a darkness she'd learned not to try to talk him out of, just to sit with, to let be what it was. They had disagreements that were real disagreements. They were 2 people who had survived separate losses and built separate habits, and were still, constantly learning how to be in the same house and on the same ground. But they were doing it. And the house was never quiet. Clara had a moment, one specific moment that she held on to afterward, that she turned over in her mind for years. The way you turn over a stone that's the right weight in your hand on a September evening near the end of that first full year. She was on the porch after supper. The light was going. The air had the particular clarity of a Montana September evening, everything sharpened and still, the mountains in the distance, doing what they always did, which was simply be themselves, with total indifference to everything smaller. She could hear Eli and Levi in the barn voices, and then a burst of laughter, Eli's higher and unconstrained, Levi's lower and real, the laugh he gave when something genuinely struck him. She could hear Nora upstairs, the specific rhythm of Nora moving around her room, reorganizing something she reorganized her room every few weeks, which Clara recognized as her own habit passed down, the way of a person who needs to feel order in her space. She could hear Molly inside, talking, which meant she was talking to Button or to herself, both of which Molly did freely. Everybody here. She stood on the porch with the September light and listened to her family inhabit the house and the barn in the evening, and she thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known 2 years ago. She had thought then that the life she was trying to hold together was all she had, that 3 children, and as in a worn trunk and a seamstress's wages were the whole of her situation, and that what she needed was a practical solution. A roof, a financial arrangement, a man who could accept what she came with as something other than a liability. He let out a short, ugly laugh. She had not thought she was arriving at a life. She had not let herself think in those terms because it was too large and too fragile, and she had already broken something that large once and couldn't survive breaking it again. But here is what she'd learned, which she hadn't expected to learn, which had arrived the way most real things arrive slowly. And then, all at once, that the life she'd been holding together in Ohio hadn't broken. That James's death hadn't broken it. That all the evictions and the judging eyes and the thin soup stretched over 3 days, none of that had broken her or her children, because broken means it doesn't work anymore. And they had kept working, all 4 of them, imperfectly, and with difficulty and with the specific stubbornness of people who have no alternative. She hadn't needed rescuing. She'd needed a door to be open. Levi Hart had been a man with an open door. The choosing had been hers. Getting on that train, writing that letter, standing on the platform with her chin level and telling him the truth, that was hers. The work of the months that followed was hers and her children's and his. Nobody had saved anybody. They had all just been honest enough and present enough and stubborn enough not to run from the difficulty. And the difficulty was the point, she thought. That was the part no one told you when they told you love stories. They told you about the feeling, the certainty, the moment of recognition. They didn't tell you about the cold mornings and the pantry arguments and the sick children and the men on horseback, trying to take what wasn't theirs and the 100 small daily negotiations of 2. People who are still becoming familiar with each other. They didn't tell you that the work of it was where it lived, that the feeling wasn't the house, just the foundation, and the house was everything you built on top of it, day after day. She had built a house, not the one behind her with its wraparound porch and reliable well, the other one, the one made of routine and honesty and showing up when it was hard, and the specific daily choice to stay open, even when staying closed felt safer. She was still building it. She would be building it for a long time. That was not a concern. That was the work she had chosen, the work she was grateful for, the work she intended to do for as long as she was capable of it. From the barn, Eli's voice, Levi, look, something about the mare, something she'd done. Levi's response, low and amused. Then both of them, together, the sound of two people standing in a barn, in the early dark, finding something worth laughing about. Clara stood on the porch. She thought about every person who had looked at her children and seen a burden. She thought about a man who looked at them and saw the very thing he'd been waiting for. She thought about Nora at the kitchen table, saying "father" with the precision of someone who had taken that word apart and examined every piece of it before she decided it was the right one. She thought about Button on the windowsill with the imperfect stitches. She thought about the letter she'd written on a Sunday night when she was out of options, and the letter that had come back in 4 days. 8 sentences? I wouldn't mind having a reason again. She had been that reason. Her children had been that reason. They had not fixed him. He had not fixed them. They had met each other in the specific mess of their respective lives and decided, each one separately and then together, that this was where they were going to be, that this was the ground worth standing on. The light went the rest of the way down. Inside, Molly called her name. Clara turned and went in. The door swung shut behind her with the sound of a house that was full, properly full, kind of full that echoes back when you speak into it. Because there are walls and furniture and people and all the warm, complicated noise of lives being lived in the same rooms. The kind of full that took years to build. The kind that once built holds. This is a story about a woman who was told too many times that she and her children were too much. And the particular cruelty of that of being made to feel that your love and your family and your need are an excess, a burden, an inconvenience, is that it doesn't only hurt on the surface. It goes down deep and changes the way you stand in rooms. It makes you small by degrees until small starts to feel like your actual size. Clara Mercer was not small. She had simply been standing among people who were made uncomfortable by her reality. What she found in Cedar Bluff, Montana, was not rescue. It was recognition. A man who looked at her as she actually was and did not look away, did not recalculate, did not ask her to reduce herself to something easier to accommodate. That is rarer than it should be. And here is the thing worth carrying out of this story, that the family you are born into is not the only family that counts. That the people who choose you, clearly and practically, and without performance, who show up in the dark for the sick child and fix the doll and sit with the arithmetic and make room at the table, those people are family in every way that matters. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not the dramatic one, not the speech, not the grand gesture. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is writing an honest letter when you're out of options and staying honest when someone writes back. Is getting on the train, is standing on the platform with your chin level, is letting the solid thing be solid, is letting the full house be full.